So there are a lot of women, even if they tend to be lean at baseline, that are like, wait a minute, what is this weight that I now have around my midsection? This is frustrating. I'm doing all the right things. I'm eating well. I'm exercising, but there's this fat that's here. Even if it's not a large amount for someone that may be a larger person, they notice this transition. And that's when that estrogen or estradiol decreases with that menopausal transition. And women notice this.
This episode was brought to you by Alloy Health and Rivian. I am so looking forward to our conversation today with Dr. Fatima Cody Stanford, a leading voice in redefining how we understand obesity and how we treat it. She's one of the few experts asking us to see this issue for what it really is, so we can finally start addressing it with a comprehensive approach. She is here to shape our national policy and also break down barriers in science, medicine, and representation. You are an obesity medicine physician and scientist at Harvard's Massachusetts General Hospital. You are trained in both internal medicine and pediatrics, so your patients can really run the gamut. As a pioneer in the field of obesity medicine, your research is foundational and among the most frequently cited. But before we get started, I really want to get on the same page about the language and how we speak about obesity, because it is really important. The message is important and the messenger is important. Absolutely. But I want you to tell me and our listeners what is really the proper terminology and the way to address individuals with obesity.
We have the disease of obesity. Persons live with obesity. They have it, but they aren't defined by it. So a person with obesity, much like a person with cancer, a person with diabetes, they are not a diabetic person or a cancerous person. They have obesity. And so that language matters. We want to use person-first language. It takes away that stigma and that bias that is so pervasive when we're dealing with persons that have obesity. We often judge the book by its cover when we're specifically talking about persons with obesity. We assume that they're lazy, that they're unmotivated, that they really caused what they have just by judging the book by its cover. And the language plays into this stigma and bias that we have towards those individuals. And so by just changing that language, it helps us to begin to address persons with the dignity and grace that they deserve as we're dealing with this disease process that is obesity. So a person with obesity, a person with mild, moderate, or severe obesity is how we would address this particular disease process.
Good. And I think that's very important for everybody to understand because it is very stigmatized. But, we also want to know what is the best way to even measure obesity, because so much of our medical research is really focused on the BMI. And we know that that is a very blunt instrument for measuring obesity, because it was never really based upon any sort of health outcome. It was just, trying to measure what's the normal weight of actual men, not even women in this country.
I'm so glad you brought this topic up. And it wasn't just men when you talked about measuring men. This BMI concept actually came from Belgium white men in the 1800s. And the last time I checked, none of us were in the 1800s. And you and I aren't white men, the Belgium white men in the 1800s. So, we have a lot of X's that don't apply to us. I'll tell you that we use waist circumference as one of the metrics to determine how much excess fat one is carrying, particularly around the midsection. Now, I'll tell you men, because men do this very much. So they'll tell me, oh, well, I wear a size 38 pants waist. But I want for those of us that have lived long enough to see someone like Steve Urkel back in the Family Matters days, that most people don't wear their pants at the belly button, okay? That's where I want us to be measuring, right? At the umbilicus, that's a fancy word for belly button, okay? We want our waist circumference to be 40 inches or less if we are a man, 35 inches or less if we are a woman. Okay, so those are two numbers we have to remember. 40 inches or less if we're a man, 35 inches or less if we're a woman. We should measure it where? at the umbilicus or belly button. You learned that new word, umbilicus, at the belly button. And we should do that to get a sense of how much fat mass we're carrying around our vital organs, like our liver, right? Because the liver likes fat. We don't want fat in the liver, though, because that leads to major issues like fatty liver, which they've actually changed the name to, because of course we like to do that in medicine, to metabolic associated steatotic liver disease. Say that 4 times fast.
Oh, that's a lot. That's a mouthful.
Right? That's a mouthful. So if that BMI, body mass index, is greater than 40, it is still in a severe category, and we still retain that for persons that are in that severe category. So hopefully, Dr. Sharon, that helps us kind of classify what we're thinking about when we're looking at when we're carrying excess fat mass, and if we have obesity-related diseases. What type of diseases? Elevated cholesterol, high blood pressure, evidence of arthritis, polycystic ovarian syndrome, something you may hear called PCOS, diabetes. These are some of the many obesity-related diseases. There are over 200 of them caused by carrying excess fat mass.
You know, you're right. I write about this in my book, in Grown Woman Talk, and I say, you know, as we're talking about where your weight is distributed is important too, because, you know, we talk about apples versus pears. And for certainly a lot of Black women, we carry weight more in our hips and thighs, which actually isn't as bad for you as having it in your waist. And so, you know, I always say, just look in the mirror, you know, even if you don't have a tape measure, it's like, is your belly, is your waist circumference, just look at, or you're more narrow at your hips than you are at your waist. And that's sort of a good indicator that there is a problem, even when your weight is not that high. So that's the other thing people should understand, is not just weight all the time that is affecting health outcomes.
Well, you know, and can I touch on that point? Because that's a really important point. And I want to talk about this specifically as it relates to women where we have that menopausal transition.
My favorite.
Okay.
Yes.
Let's talk about that. Because there are 3 major times in women's lives where we have major weight shifts. And let's talk about those 3 major times. That's the onset of menarche. Okay. That's when we get our menstrual cycles. Okay. As adolescents. At pregnancy, whether or not that leads to a viable offspring, and at the also desired menopause. And I'll let you decide if I'm being facetious when I say that. When we go into that menopausal transition, we have a transition of fat stores from having fat stored in our hip, buttock, and thigh region, which is a gynoid distribution of weight. Gynoid sounds like gynecology, right? Like that's the work you do, right? Into having an android, not an Android-based phone. Okay, android means male-like, which means central deposition of fat. It goes and migrates to this midsection. So there are a lot of women, even if they tend to be lean at baseline, that are like, wait a minute, what is this weight that I now have around my midsection? This is frustrating. I'm doing all the right things. I'm eating well. I'm exercising, but there's this fat that's here. Even if it's not a large amount for someone that may be a larger person, they notice this transition. And that's when that estrogen or estradiol decreases with that menopausal transition. And women notice this. And this is across racial ethnic lines. It doesn't matter. It's just that menopausal transition causes that migration of fat mass to that midsection. And that can be highly frustrating.
One thing that amazes me is that as we sort of we've watched the demographics over a couple of generations, what we've seen that the rates of obesity and the obesity-related diseases have increased dramatically over the past 50 years. And it's not just race-specific. America has gotten fat, but Black women, Native American women, and Hispanic women have gotten fatter faster. So what changed? What happened? You know, we didn't all get a new set of genes in a generation or two, but what is it about how we live, or what is in our environment that is causing these obesity-related changes earlier and more severely?
I want to talk about the number one thing that I think is, you know, causing those specific groups you just talked about. Let's talk about stress. When stress goes up, storage of fat goes up. And I want to talk about a time that all of us can remember very vividly, and I'm going to talk about COVID-19. So let's talk about COVID-19, and let's talk about what the number one risk factor for death and dying was during COVID-19, and that was obesity. It wasn't what was making the news stories, but I can tell you that in every single paper that we've evaluated in the academic literature, we know that the number one risk factor for death and dying during COVID was indeed obesity. And it was because it was the perfect storm. We have a chronic inflammatory condition, which is obesity, interacting with an acute, which means something that comes on acutely and quickly, COVID, and it caused you, unfortunately, to either get very, very sick, and often to die. Now, one of the things that increases, unfortunately, during this time also was a lot of stress associated with COVID. One of the things that was a common denominator, regardless of who you were during COVID, was stress. We saw stress go up, and a lot of people assumed that people were gaining weight during COVID was because they were inactive. But let's think about certain companies. Let's think about some company like Peloton, whose stock went up dramatically during the COVID-19 pandemic because people were being more active. They had time to be active. So activity actually went up during the pandemic. That wasn't what went up, but stress went up universally. So storage of fat mass went up. The demographics that you spoke about, Black women, Hispanic women, Native or Indigenous women, this is something that's germane. We tend to carry and hold on the weight of our entire demographic. We carry the burdens of allostatic load more than other groups. And this chronic stress and stressors that we deal with in the form of racism, in the form of being single mothers, in the form of a lot of things that we end up dealing with, end up being burdens that end up turning into fat storage as we prepare for the famine that doesn't typically come. And I think that this is something that's not widely discussed, but I think it's something that we really have to address if we think about why is it that we indeed carry this burden more than other groups. Now, it's not the only reason, but I think that we would be remiss if we didn't make this part of the conversation.
Right. And I get that. And I talk about stress a lot and how it affects all parameters of our health, not just our weight. But I think the thing that is most disturbing is that it's happening earlier to our children and to young adults. And this has immense implications for how we are going to age and age healthfully if you are already having issues with obesity when you're 12 years old. And there are more and more children that are being diagnosed with obesity. And I will say this because, I'm a little bit older than you are. And
just a smidge.
Just a generation or so. But when I remember distinctly, when I was in elementary school, there was one fat girl and one fat boy in class.
We don't use those words.
I know.
One
I'm
kid
just saying
with
that's
excess
why,
adiposity.
Well, that's what I'm going to say that because I'm old. Okay. But this is how we talked about it 50 years ago. But that was the case.
Yeah.
And then now, as you look in the classrooms,
you see a much higher percentage.
It's almost the norm. What's happening there?
Well, it's now, I will say this multifactorial. Now, there are studies, so I'm going to put on my pediatrics hat now. So if you guys may not see it, but the pediatrics hat is on. So let's go and let's look at some of the studies. There was a wonderful study that I often cite when I'm giving my pediatric keynotes. And we're going to look at the difference between young Black girls versus young white girls at the onset of menses, since we talked about, so this is the onset of your menstrual period. I'm putting back on my layperson hat. And we actually see that when we have that onset of menses for young Black girls versus young white girls, first of all, that period of pubertal transition, at that pubertal transition, that young Black girls actually have less fat mass at baseline. But something about that pubertal transition allows for a greater fat accumulation with that introduction of estradiol. We actually see that in the clinical studies, both in Europe and here in the US. So something about that hormonal transition seems to affect young Black girls more, such that when we then make that pubertal transition, which appears to happen actually earlier at baseline for young Black girls than those of a European descent, that the fat mass accumulation appears to be much more pronounced than those of European descent. Now, let's take into account that we're also in an obesogenic environment. What do I mean by obesogenic environment? We have an environment that doesn't prioritize sleep. We know that if we look at the studies, and there was a wonderful study that was published in Pediatrics back in 2009 that tracked the sleep of persons between the ages of 3 and 32. And it showed that if your sleep is not optimized for between those key years, that the people that have worsened sleep, meaning not the best quantity and quality of sleep between the ages of 3 and 32, are going to have higher weight statuses at 32. If that's not optimized, then that's not great. We know that sleep quality has changed and worsened. I'm actually old enough, Dr. Sharon, to remember when the TV used to happen. You remember when the lines used to come on the TV because the programming used to stop?
Yeah.
Well, we're no longer in that era. You can get everything on demand now because that's the era we lived in. I also remember when the internet didn't exist and you couldn't go online and actually look for things. Well, we're no longer in that era, which means it disrupts sleep and circadian rhythm. When our circadian rhythm is disrupted, so when we're not just awake when it's bright outside and sleep when it's dark outside, that disrupts our weight and weight cycles. Our food, whether it's when it's processed and not quite healthy for us, and what I mean healthy, lean proteins, whole grains, fruits, and vegetables, that's going to disrupt our weight and weight status. And so when you add all of these together, there's a perfect storm of things that are happening that are going to lead us to having greater weight status compared to where you were when you think about what your classroom looked like compared to what my classroom looked like in the late 70s, 80s, early 90s, and then what we're looking at now in the 2020s. So I think it's that complex multifactorial thing that we have to think about that have led us to where we are now, that we have to realize that there's not one solution to the problem. It's going to take multi-sector, multifactorial approaches to address the situation.
This episode of The Second Opinion with Dr. Sharon is brought to you by Alloy Health. My favorite saying is, there are no accidents in the universe. 5 years ago, my friend Michelle Obama invited me on her podcast to discuss menopause. So this is a full circle moment. She very honestly discussed her menopausal symptoms and what she chose to do about them. Michelle Obama was one of the first famous people to admit that, yes, I had debilitating hot flashes and drenching sweats, and I did something about it. What she didn't do was suffer through it. By normalizing this conversation, she took the shame and stigma out of menopause. Believe it or not, that exact conversation was the catalyst that led me to becoming the chief medical advisor at Alloy Health. The founders of Alloy Health, Ann Fullenwater and Monica Mollenauer, heard that conversation and tracked me down, and I am glad they did. After nearly 30 years of private practice, Alloy Health has allowed me to leverage my expertise, not just to my patients one-on-one, but has given me the opportunity to bring this information to women everywhere. My whole career has been about helping women feel empowered to advocate for their health. And Alloy was created with this specifically in mind. Join the 95% of women who tried Alloy and saw relief in the first 2 weeks. Head to myalloy.com and tell them all about your symptoms, and you'll get a fully customized treatment plan. And you'll get $25 off your first order today when you use code TSO25. Head to myalloy.com and enter code TSO25 to get $25 off your first order. This episode is brought to you by our friends at Rivian and their all-electric, full-size SUVs and trucks made for all of life's adventures. Rivian just announced their all-new Rivian Quad, their fastest, most capable vehicle yet. Powered by 4 motors, one for each wheel, it gives you unmatched traction, control, and performance anywhere you are. On winding roads or off-road trails, the quad is engineered for precision driving and maximum adventure. With a native NACS port, the quad is compatible with 50,000 DC fast chargers, so getting back on the road is hassle-free. With beautifully designed interiors, tons of storage, and incredible capability inside and out, the quad is made for everyday comfort and rugged utility. Plus, you'll love the tech. The Rivian experience gets better over time with software updates. The premium audio experience sounds as good as the ride feels. Premium audio is part of the Sound Plus Vision package in quad and tri vehicles and can be a paid upgrade in dual models. And the Rivian Autonomy Platform Plus, a paid subscription product, offers a full suite of advanced safety and driver assistance features. There is adaptive cruise control, active lane keeping, blind spot monitoring, and forward collision warning with automatic emergency braking. Check out the all-new, all-electric quad truck or SUV and the full lineup of vehicles now at Rivian.com. As a physician and a mother who treasures time with family and friends, I know how important it is to slow down and make room for the moments that really matter. One of my favorite memories is a trip I took with good girlfriends to connect on where we were in our lives. So instead of booking separate hotel rooms, we found a beautiful Airbnb home where we could stay all under one roof. We cooked together, laughed together, and shared our stories. Maintaining our relationships is how we have kept close and grown our friendship circle over the decades. Those moments of closeness are what makes travel so meaningful. Airbnb makes it possible to choose a place that truly fits the occasion, whether that's a cozy apartment for a quick getaway or a spacious home for family celebrations. And while my family has been guests, we've also experienced the other side of Airbnb as hosts. It's been wonderful to see how opening your home can bring joy to others and help make travel more personal. Hosting is not only a way to share your space, but also a way to discover the value in it. You may be surprised what your home could be worth while you're away. Find out how much at airbnb.com/host. We have really, and this is, I can't emphasize this enough about how important it is that we take it for what it is, the multifactorial disease. But we are often underrepresented in clinical trials. And I think one of the things that frustrates me is that whenever there's research and they say, well, there are only 5% of, African Americans and no Native Americans and, few Hispanics in studies. And they'll go, oh, well, it's because, they don't want to participate. And we know that that's not true. People don't participate because oftentimes they're just not asked.
Right.
And it matters who the investigators are, who the researchers
100%.
are tremendously in terms of getting buy-in. Tell me, when you're out there and you're speaking to people where they are, what is the buy-in that you get versus, say, another researcher?
Well, I think that the buy-in is much more, people are much more readily accepting of what I have to bring to them because I look the part. I'm coming to them like a girl from the ATL. I don't, I can do the Harvard thing if I need to do it, but I'm from Southwest Atlanta. I mean, I went to Atlanta Public Schools. I can be that because that's who I am, right? I don't have to put on a show to bring that to you. If we need to do, Harvard, we can do Harvard, but my goal is to meet you where you are.
Right. One thing I want to ask you about, and I think that you will understand this in a way, the same way that I understand this, growing up in the South. And that is, how do you get the communities that are at risk to understand really the serious health challenge that obesity poses, that we are not coming in. This isn't a matter of we're fat shaming. This isn't an issue of saying that we are not affirming people's body positivity.
Absolutely.
But we really want them to understand. It's like, no, I don't really care about that. That's not, we're not looking for a particular body type, but I really want you to understand what this means to you in your short-term and long-term health. So how do you frame that conversation?
It takes time. When you're working with communities that look like ours, you don't go on day one and get people to trust and believe that you're going to have their best interests in mind, unless you're a part of that community or grew up in that community. So, for example, I'm going to take you back to the year 1999, 2000, when I was recruiting Black churches in Atlanta for a study. And we were talking about these issues within those communities. But the only reason I was able to get them to believe and understand in what I was saying was because I grew up in that community. So they were like, oh, that's little Fatima. You remember she grew up in this community. So I had buy-in because I was a part of that community. I grew up, I was born, I was raised. And so, she's part of this community. She's not just coming in as an outsider and bringing in her voice. And so I can tell you right now, I am still the primary supporter of the food pantry that is for the church that I grew up in Atlanta. So you can imagine that when I go back and still work within that community, I'm not just this outsider that lives in Boston and teaches at Harvard Medical School. I'm still very much a part of that community. And if I'm coming back speaking about these issues, I'm still entrenched in the fabric that is that community. And I think for us to really come in and speak, you can't just be, I'm going to come in with my hoity-toity thought processes and say these things. You need to be a part of that community, and you have to say that I'm willing to be here, do the work, still be here and do the work, and be doing that work for 35 plus years, which is what I've been doing in that Atlanta church community. So that when I come back and show up, they're not just like, she's showing up and then she's going to leave. She's going to be still part of this community and showing that she cares. And we're going to believe and we're going to adopt these principles into our daily lives.
Exactly. And you can do that in a very non-judgmental way of getting buy-in. One of the other interesting things that you talk about, and I understand this in a way that probably a lot of our listeners may not, but that is the connection between our brains and our weight. And why is it, it's not just a matter of, you eat too much because it's delicious, but what is it about the communications between our brains and our eating behavior?
Yeah. Let me explain this. I'm going to get a little scientific for the audience, so bear with me for a second, but then I'll bring it back down. So let me just explain it, because I think this is important to understand as we really start to learn about obesity and why this is a brain disease. The brain, particularly a portion of the brain called the hypothalamus, is what governs our hunger, how hungry we feel, and satiety, how long it takes us to feel full once we actually start eating. And the hypothalamus is getting signals from different parts of our body. It's getting signals from our stomach. It's getting signals from our fat tissue, our small and large intestine. It's sending signals back to our brain to tell us how much to eat and how much to store, okay? But let's talk about this pathway in our brain that's our pathway that's really governing. So there's a anorexogenic pathway. When we hear anorexia, we start thinking about leanness. Mm-hmm. And there's a pathway that's called the POMC pathway. And if we upregulate that pathway, you can imagine we just don't want to eat or store very much. And that pathway can be upregulated, okay? So that's the POMC or the anorexogenic pathway. But we also have another pathway in our brain, which is the orexogenic. Orexogenic is the opposite of anorexogenic. And the orexogenic tells us to eat, and it tells us to store. You can imagine we may not want to go down that pathway so much because we'll want to eat a lot, okay? And that's the AGRP pathway. Now, we've been hearing a lot about these GLP-1 drugs, right? These drugs that everybody
and
wants,
we're
right?
going to get there.
We're
Going to go there in this conversation.
But these medications kind of work in these pathways, right? So we want to stimulate that anorexogenic pathway, right? That makes us feel full, right? It makes us not very hungry. And we don't want that orexogenic pathway to be stimulated. But these brain-gut communications happen, and they're happening here. And people think it's just a matter of willpower. But some of us have more of these hormones that are being signaled to our brain tell us to go down that anorexogenic pathway. It's not something that we're doing to ourselves. We just happen to have more of that good stuff inside of us, like GLP-1. Believe it or not, all of us have GLP-1 inside of us here in our gut that's being sent to our brain to tell us to eat less and store less. But for those of us that haven't been as privileged to have as much, maybe we need to give them some of that to stimulate that pathway. So that's kind of a little bit of how it works.
So many of us, most of us don't just keep getting fatter and fatter and fatter and fatter. You get to a certain point, and I'll say, putting on adipose tissue more and more and more. I will correct that. You'll forgive me. But, we get to a certain point and we defend that spot. And we can stay there no matter what you do. You eat more, you eat less, and you still hover around that. Now, where does that set point come from? That's also in your brain as well?
Your brain is kind of decided. Think of it as kind of like a thermostat, right? Think about, and it's really interesting because, people think about their thermostats. If you have like heating or air conditioning in your home or wherever you live, and you set your thermostat at like, I don't know, let's use a number. Let's call it 68 degrees. And you want your thermostat to be at 68. And so whenever it gets above 68 in your home, the air conditioning, let's say, comes on to cool it back down to 68, and then it goes off, right? And then if it gets below, it's going to, keeps adjusting, right? And so just think of your body in very much the same way. So the brain sees, let's pick a number. I don't know. What number do you want to pick, Dr. Sharon? What weight do you want to pick?
The weight I would like to be, or the weight that I actually
whatever
am?
For a person. We'll pick something, not for you, but just for someone.
Right, someone. Okay, let's just say 150 pounds. Let's just
say so let's say 150 pounds. That's a lovely number. We'll just pick that. We're just going to pick that as the number. And so let's say, the set point is 150 pounds. And let's say the holidays. Let's just pick the holidays. The holidays come around, you may get above that. Let's say some of you get to like 160, 162. But, as we come into the new year, your body comes, gradually back to 150. But, it may have gotten above that, but it knows it needs to kind of come back and it settles back. And you're like, okay, things are back to normal. I'm feeling pretty good about it. But, then it creeps back up. Maybe a birthday comes or some type of celebration. You went on vacation and then it kind of comes back. So it kind of knows that this is that thermometer. It compensates. It knows what it needs to do. There's different hormones in the body. You adjust. It's not even that you're necessarily making particular strategies to do it, but it knows that that's kind of the set point. Now, what's very interesting for most of us as we age is that over time, that set point may creep up, right? We can think back to our high school selves and be like, maybe that set point was a little bit lower then. And then it kind of gradually crept up. And then as we get to around the age of 60, 65, we'll notice a little bit of a decline. And people think, hey, well, I'm losing weight. Not so fast, Mr. or Miss or whomever. What happens at that age is that we start losing muscle mass. And so that weight loss that's happening isn't true weight loss. It's weight loss associated with the muscle loss. So we're losing not favorable weight, we're losing muscle. And this is why we also start to see people start to struggle to be able to do things like get up and out of their seat. It takes them longer to ambulate, which is just a fancy word for moving about the space, getting up and walking and going. And so while that weight starts to decline very gradually, it's not a very good weight loss. But that's really, hopefully I explained that set point is just the body bringing itself back to what it sees is where it's supposed to be.
And for most people, that's just sort of a natural thing. It sort of drifts up whether you want to or not.
It does.
Here's a good question that in your research, are there any medications or drugs that can actually directly address the set point? That can move that one?
It's not that it addresses the set point, but we know that medications that we use to treat obesity they don't change the set point. They just address the excess adiposity while you're taking them. So they don't change the set point, right? Because as soon as you stop taking whatever agent being addressed at whatever part of the brain we were addressing, as soon as we pull it back, right, we're going to regain, right? They're only effective while you're taking them, just like treating any other chronic disease, right? Like if we're treating hypertension or high blood pressure, the medicine works while you're taking it, or if we're treating high cholesterol, it works while you're taking it. But as soon as you remove that agent, whatever that set point was prior to the initiation of such agent will resume.
Well, it's like whoever figures that out will, put everybody else out of business when they figure out how to move that thermostat. Yeah. It's like, I would like to set it at, whatever your desired weight is.
So, think about it. So bariatric surgery, right, which is grossly underutilized, particularly for those that have severe obesity. It can change set point, right? So for those that have severe obesity, it moves them from having this severe mass of excess adipose, right? The excess fat mass. And it can bring them down to, let's say, I don't believe normal. We're putting normal in air quotes. It can bring them, let's say, to here. And it, let's say, may not bring them to what was quote unquote normal, whatever we think that is, but it can change them from that severe group into a much reduced state. So surgery, because it does work on the brain and gut, a lot of people think it's just working on the gut, but it is doing quite a number on the brain, which is how we learned about a lot of these medications that are being utilized currently and are being evaluated for future use. It's important for us to recognize that bariatric surgery is how we've learned about that, and is actually changing set point, for lack of a better way of saying it.
See, this is a perfect segue because we cannot leave this conversation without talking about the medications that are available now that everybody's talking about with the GLP-1s. And we've got, and these are the name brands of like Ozempic and Wegovy and Zepbound and Mounjaro, all of these medications. And, so I think you've explained a little bit about how they work, the hormones that sort of, make you feel more full. And they also work, they decrease your sort of gut motility. Things don't move through.
Yeah, they decrease
quickly.
Gastric emptying, right? Yeah. So the GLP-1 component, they actually slow movement through the GI tract. So if they slow movement through the GI tract, you can imagine, let's say you go to eat breakfast and they're moving things slowly, you may forget to eat lunch and get to dinner and be like, honestly, I think I'm still full. And this, you don't want to people to skip meals. We actually just released on this past Friday joint guidelines between the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, the American Society of Nutrition, the Obesity Medicine Association, and the Obesity Society. We released the nutrition guidelines for patients on GLP-1s, which are freely available. Because what we find is some people are not hungry at all. Because that's a problem. So we don't want you to have nothing to eat. That's not the goal. We're not trying to starve you. The goal is that you still are going to need nutrients, and then we're going to give you guidance on what those nutrients are going to look like, which are going to actually mirror a lot of what guidance we're giving. And this was a great segue. What we are telling those patients that have undergone bariatric surgery, a kind of a higher protein base, lean protein, vegetables, fruits, beans, legumes, lentils, things of this sort, small frequent meals, staying away, making sure we're well hydrated. These types of things are things that we're really thinking about, but making sure that we are getting in nutrients and not just completely skipping meals altogether, which is what we may often see, particularly for people that are really high responders to these medications.
And do you find that patients who are on the GLP-1s, that there is, because of the fact that they may not, if they're not paying attention to their nutrition and protein, is it true that they can be losing more muscle?
Absolutely.
And that's a problem as you age as well?
100% sure. I mean, I think that this is an important consideration, right? We're not completely like bariatric surgery, where we know there can be some bone and muscle loss, where we have some deep data. I've helped publish some of that literature on both the pediatric and adult side. We do know that there is some component of both muscle and fat loss. Now, I will say that even when you undergo weight loss in a more traditional sense, and what do I mean by more traditional sense? Just utilizing lifestyle, which would be diet and exercise, we lose both fat and muscle. So a lot of people aren't aware of that. When you exercise and you restrict your diet, you lose fat and muscle. So it's not just these medications. However, you may have a greater tendency, right? Because usually the degree of weight loss is more pronounced with the use of a GLP-1 or dual agonist, which is something like tirzepatide. And so we do have to be paying attention to this. And particularly as we think about older adults, which would be classified as anyone 60 plus, for the things that we talked about a little bit earlier, right? We want you to be living an active life where you're able to do things like get up and go and chase after your grandkids, or be able to get up out of your seat unassisted. Those are the things that are really important to be able to do. Have a good hand grip. These are the things that we would like for you to be able to do, to open up a can or to, a jar or things of this sort. If you're having issues with being able to perform these tasks, then we know that there's a problem.
Well, I'm gonna ask you a couple of rapid fire questions, because I know that people have a lot of questions about GLP-1s. And here's one that I hear a lot, and that is, how long can you be on a GLP-1?
So the goal is to be on these chronically, which means indefinitely.
Indefinite.
Yep,
okay.
That's the answer.
Okay. And have you had any patients who've had success sort of coming off GLP-1s and being able to maintain the weight loss?
I have not seen that.
Wow.
So the answer is no.
Okay. Well, that's good to know.
Yes.
Now, what about microdosing? Is that a thing?
No. So we have no, and I don't recommend that. We don't have any data. So I, as a scientist, we don't have any data on what patients look like with microdosing. That's usually based on people that are using compounding drugs, and I don't endorse the use of compounded agents. And we actually have eliminated compounders altogether. So I've never prescribed compounded medications. And so I wouldn't recommend that as a practice.
And for our listeners and viewers who don't know what microdosing is, that just means using less than what is a standard dose that you use for weight loss. But people thinking, well, maybe I need to just lose 10 pounds and I'll just take a small amount. And they have been using that. So here's another question. Why do they cost so much?
Okay, now this is a very important question. Because if we look at our neighbors, and when I say our neighbors, those neighbors north of us in Canada, and those neighbors across the pond. And when I say the pond, I'm talking about the Atlantic Ocean, which of course is not a pond. We know that the price of these medications is about 1/5 the price of what we see here in the United States. So I do think that there is a price issue that should be addressed in terms of how exorbitant the price is. When we talk about the difference in what we're seeing is that these are single payer systems. So the ability to negotiate the price in Canada or the UK in a single payer system is much better than in a competitive market that we have here in the United States. And so the price point is still much too high here in the US.
What do you think about for women who are coming in with that midlife sort of weight gain and body composition changes that are accompanying menopause? Would GLP-1s be a good solution for that? And these are women, and these are my patients who they've tried, and I believe them. I honestly do believe them.
Well, the number one person seeking obesity medications throughout my entire career is going to be a postmenopausal white woman. That is the number one person in any of the trials. So this is, I would say, the number one person that would be a great person to consider for these. And this is the person, if you go and look at the trials, if you look at the semaglutide trials or the tirzepatide trials, the two agents that are the kind of more highly effective agents that are on or available, these are going to be the people that you're going to see. So absolutely, these are the patients that you would consider. Yep.
So how do we from a policy point of view, ensure that these medications are equitably distributed to the people who need them and not just the people who are like, I can afford it. I'll spend $1,000 on medication.
I have been fighting this fight since 2012, specifically as it relates to the coverage of these medications. So there was a bill that was introduced initially in Congress back in 2012 called the Treat and Reduce Obesity Act. It sought to do two different things: to, number one, cover behavioral therapy for the treatment of obesity, meaning the treatment with the use of dietitians to treat obesity. Right now, if you have obesity and you want to meet with a dietitian and you happen to fall under Medicare, that visit is not covered by Medicare. So that's problematic. I think you have to get diabetes to get that visit covered. So wait until you get diabetes and your dietitian visit will be covered. So that sounds a little bit problematic. The second provision would be the coverage of obesity medications.
Yeah.
So the fact that we would not treat the group that is most likely to glean benefit with numerous clinical trials coming out every day to support the safety, efficacy, and benefit in seniors. And what I can tell you, what hurts me most is when I see my patients nearing Medicare and knowing that they'll have to come off meds. And then the question that you asked me previously was how many patients are regaining their weight when they come off of them. So my patients that were employee-sponsored insurance and then have to hit Medicare, and then I have to withdraw them from the med, not because I want to, but because Medicare won't cover. And then I see them have that reemergence of their obesity and obesity-related chronic diseases, and it truly breaks my heart.
If you can treat one of the main causes of not just heart disease and diabetes, but of cancer and
Absolutely.
things that, ultimately you'll end up in a nursing home because of some of these complications. This saves us all money. So I think that we need voices like yours out there to make this case. And I cannot tell you how wonderful this conversation was today. I hope you'll come back so
I
we
would
can
love to be back.
All right. So we have more. I bet we'll have many, many, many questions that come up as a result of this. And so when you have the time, I would love to continue this conversation. So thank you
to be back.
so much, Dr. Fatima. It's time for the last part of the show where I give my doctor's orders and leave you with takeaways from today's conversation. Obesity is a complex and multifactorial disease. It has health consequences throughout the entire body for your entire lifespan. It deserves to be treated seriously by the medical profession. Number 2, when discussing obesity, we should be addressing health goals, not specific weight targets. Weight management is a lifelong endeavor. And number 3, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to weight loss. You deserve a thorough evaluation of all of the factors that may be contributing to your weight gain. It is not a personal failure. It is a serious health issue. For more details and links, be sure to check out our show notes for the episode. Keep joining in each week on YouTube or wherever you find your podcast as I break down complex medical issues and leave you with expert medical advice. If you enjoyed the show, follow us so you never miss an episode. And if you like what you hear, leave a review. Until next time, take care.